Who here is ready for war?
The Third World War is not only inevitable, but is already taking place in new forms.
Painful trade-offs will be unavoidable.
The Ukraine war is accelerating the decline of the West.
We have enough nuclear megatonnage to set human life back to the Dark Ages.
In the fall of 2025, I visited Montreal to interview the economist and founder of globalresearch.ca, Michel Chossudovsky. Michel has a resume as long as the Bible and has dedicated his life to reporting on political inequities to bring truth and understanding to the public. In this interview, we discussed the conflicts in Ukraine, Palestine, the West's use of economic warfare, and the prospect of a global nuclear war.
My name is Michel Chossudovsky. I'm professor of economics emeritus at the University of Ottawa. I'm an author, but in a more substantive way, I'm responsible for the website which is called globalresearch.ca. It's the Center for Research on Globalization. We are independent media. We are committed to the truth. We're committed to dialogue. It's not strictly a point of view. We've no political affiliations, and we are committed at this particular juncture in world history. We are committed to peace and humanity worldwide. What we call euphemistically US foreign policy is now characterized by economic actions which are devastating. I'm talking about energy prices. I'm talking about the imposition of tariffs. We're not simply dealing with with isolated military operations. It's at the level of the entire planet. And what's happening in China has repercussions of what's happening in the Middle East. And what is happening on the border with Ukraine and Russia has a bearing on the entire fabric of what we call the Western countries. I think it's very important to show, first of all, that there are lies and fabrications, and that's the media. Now, the media are lying through their teeth. They're not presenting realities in a way which can be understood by people across the land. We have to understand that there was an interwar period between World War I and World War II, but in effect there was some very major military operations which took place during that period. And then, of course, there was the emergence of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, but there was very little understanding as to how countries with competing economic and social systems could have exchange and coexistence. Now, I mean, we might consider this as ideological, but the Russians at one point said, we are in favor of dialogue and coexistence with the West. And the fact of the matter is that they did not necessarily deny the existence of capitalism within their own realm, okay? But it would appear that the wars which emerged in the wake of World War I and the fact that many of the countries were heavily indebted were conducive to the outbreak of World War II. We are currently in a global conflict, but it is not something which can be described in a few words. If you look at US military doctrine, there's a geography, and there are war plans. Now, we might say those war plans are there to defend ourselves against a foreign country. But what is important to understand is that we have several poles in the world system. We could say that on the one hand, we have the conflict between Western Europe and the Russian Federation, which has evolved in relation to the war in Ukraine. It's a very serious war. It is heavily misunderstood, in as much as Russia and Ukraine, in fact, are countries which are almost identical in terms of culture and language and so on. And we are led to believe that ultimately this is a separate country. That war has been triggered, and it goes back to an attempted coup d'etat, what was called the Euromaidan, back in 2014. It was a US-sponsored coup d'etat, and what was very serious is that it was also in support of two neo-Nazi parties. One was called Svoboda and the other one is called Right Sector. The coalition government of Ukraine is largely dominated by these Nazi elements. Now, that is important, and that's something we cannot neglect, because those who control the government are the descendants of the organization of Ukrainian nationalism, which collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II. This Ukrainian nationalism, which is in the region bordering Poland, there was a Jewish community which was substantial, and the Ukrainian Nazis, which collaborated with Nazi Germany, were responsible for crimes against humanity, and in other words, it was part of the Holocaust there. That history has to be understood, because the allies of Ukraine, let's take the principal allies within NATO. Let's take Germany. Now, Germany is very actively involved, particularly under the new administration. They are actively involved in supporting the Ukrainian government. The current president of Ukraine, he didn't know a word of Ukrainian before he entered politics. Okay, that's on record. He is from a Russian Jewish family. He was an actor. And incidentally, if you look at his movies, some of his movies would be under the legislation that they implemented, saying Russian books are excluded, Russian music is excluded, you can't listen to Tchaikovsky, you can't, and so on, okay? Now, there you are. He made his election campaign and he said, we are Russians, Ukrainians, we're all together, etc., etc. But he collaborated with these two neo-Nazi parties. Now, so all this issue of anti-Semitism has to be also, we have various war theaters. Well, we have a war theater in Palestine. Anybody who is against who's against the killing of civilians in Palestine will immediately be tagged as being anti-Semitic. We can look at the Geneva Convention law on genocide. I can tell you that if you analyze those documents, Article 3 I know it by heart. It's Article 3A, complicity. Anybody who is complicity in an act of genocide is passible of punishment. That is international law. It's not international justice. International justice are the entities, the judicial entities, which manage to ignore those realities. But now if you go back to Ukraine, you have a government which is partly controlled by two Nazi parties. In other words, we can't have double standards with regard to genocide or Nazi governments or Nazi elements within our societies. Well, you know, I would say that in many regards the West is far more advanced in terms of industrial production than Russia. Russia is advanced in terms of military technologies, and it has put emphasis on the development of the military right throughout its history. I mean, going back to Napoleon, okay? This is an enormous country, and the empire extended largely in the 19th century, and there have been threats by various powers, but largely by Nazi Germany. And now I would say that most probably this is also a threat on the part of NATO, because there was an agreement. What the Russians are saying, you have to respect the sovereignty of our borders, and they also have to respect the fact that Ukraine is a Russian-speaking country which was formerly part of the Soviet Union. The major forces behind migration from the Ukraine is the country is at war. I want to get out. And if you look at the other component is poverty and despair. And that is also what is attached to the application of these neoliberal agendas, where they go into a country, the World Bank and the IMF go into a country and say, well, you have to open up your borders and you have to reduce the cost of this, that, and other, and you have to let these corporations come in, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's colonialism or semi-colonialism. We see it throughout Africa, and Africa is a tremendously wealthy continent, and what these semi-colonial arrangements require is that they can come in and they can exploit resources, mining, oil, and so on. And that, what does it do under the jurisdiction of the Washington Consensus? It leads to mass poverty throughout Africa, mass poverty in several countries in Asia. And where do the people go? They say, well, let's go to America. Yes, well, this is a book which it took me quite a number of years to write this book, because it's all based on case studies and so on, okay? Now, let me give you an example of what neoliberalism in practice signifies. As I mentioned, I spent the first years of my professional life, I witnessed two major military coups. One was Chile, the other one was Argentina, respectively 1973 and the other one was Argentina. Both devastating, with a dirty war and so on, but neoliberal policies were applied in these countries. We know that, but it wasn't necessarily the military dictators who were dictating the conduct of economic policy. A few years later, in Peru, it was a democracy, and that was in 1990. And what happened? Fujimori was elected president, and then a few days later, he ordered a 31-fold increase in the price of oil, of petrol, of gasoline. 31 times. Now that is not a free market choice there. That is a manipulation of the market. If you look at what happened to Peru in the early 90s, it's devastating. I mean, we have similar situations occurring in Western countries where from one day to the next the price of energy goes fly high. Now, energy prices are manipulated. The United States, its foreign policy wants to avoid is that Russia sells cheap oil and gas to Western Europe. That's what they want to avoid. And they must understand, of course, that Russia is the largest producer of natural gas worldwide. War is multi-dimensional. You have war entrenched in the media, because the media is misleading people as to causes and consequences of these wars. But you raised the issue of Syria. Now, from the Syrian perspective, this occupation by a head of state who was planted there by the United States and NATO, and who happens to be a member of an Al-Qaeda affiliated organization. I've done a fair amount of research on 9/11, and I thought that from the analysis of 9/11 and the official narrative, Al-Qaeda are the bad guys, because they brought down the towers. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't believe it. But what is significant is they said they have attacked our country. They never attacked. Afghanistan never attacked the United States. There were no Afghan planes in the skies of New York that day. And then they say, well, Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden is protected by Afghanistan. And that is total fabrication as well. But the irony is that now you have an Al-Qaeda guy, a good Al-Qaeda guy, who is the head of state in Syria. Now there's something wrong. Is that sloppy intelligence, or is it simply, I mean, anybody who has a common sense will say, well, the United States of America and NATO invaded Afghanistan because the head of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, ordered the downing of the Twin Towers, and in fact a third one, which was Building 7. Okay, but they don't have any proof that Al-Qaeda was behind it. But what's on top of that, they're now appointing an Al-Qaeda head of state in Syria. Now, is one of them is a bad guy, another one is a good guy? The Afghan government, through diplomatic channels, had and this is on record, they had stated very clearly, we are prepared to envisage the exodus or the repatriation of Osama bin Laden from Afghanistan if you give us some evidence that he was behind the 9/11 attacks. Okay, they through diplomatic channels, that's what happened, and George W. Bush said we don't negotiate with terrorists. Now that, in other words, they could have extradited Osama bin Laden back to the United States to be judged by the FBI or whatever, but they didn't do it. And I have the documents on that. It's all on record that Afghanistan was not supportive of Al-Qaeda, and they weren't supportive of Osama bin Laden, and yet their country was invaded and impoverished and destroyed. Obama had come up with the notion that the main threat in the wake of the Cold War was Al-Qaeda. the terrorists. And he said, and he went all over the world and had large-scale meetings and so on. He said, what is important is to recognize that the terrorists may take control over nuclear bombing technology and they may threaten us. Okay? Now, all that's on record. All his speeches on record. First of all, they don't know how to deliver these atomic bombs, but he nonetheless convinces public opinion that the threat, he didn't say the threat comes from Russia, okay? He could have said that, okay? And I would say that would make more sense because Russia was much more advanced in terms of nuclear technology than the United States. But he says, no, the problem is Al-Qaeda. The problem are the terrorists, and we must ensure that it doesn't fall in their hands. Now, he got the Nobel Prize for that. He got the Nobel Prize, and then he instigated a $1 trillion nuclear weapons program, which was largely directed against the mini nukes, the tactical nuclear weapons, which were categorized, and that's of course another sort of misinformation or lie. They would say that these tactical nuclear weapons are harmless to civilians because the explosion is underground. These tactical nuclear weapons were then, some of them were recategorized as conventional weapons. There you have a president of the United States that knows fairly well, he has some understanding of military technologies, that to say that Al-Qaeda would become a threat, and for that reason we're going to have a massive $1 trillion nuclear weapons program, which has now gone up to 1.3 trillion. That was during the Biden administration. Yeah. And where does the money go? And what could you have done with $1 trillion in terms of social development, infrastructure, schools, hospitals? I think that any actions taken by Netanyahu or the Netanyahu government are approved by US NATO. And back in 2000, I think it was 2003 or so, Israel, there were a couple of stages, but Israel is a de facto member of NATO. From the fact that they consult, okay? I don't think any of those actions would have been taken place without the approval of the United States. I have been investigating the issue of the maritime gas reserves which belong to Palestine off the Gaza coastline, which is in the billions. And they were never allowed to exploit them, despite the fact that there was a decision by the Israeli Supreme Court that it belonged to them. It belonged to Palestine. Right from 2023, in October, the Ministry of Intelligence released a document, quite extensive, which was essentially a plan to commit genocide with different options. Now, it was released by the Minister of Intelligence, and it was the Minister of Intelligence that sent it to the Netanyahu cabinet, and in the video she makes the statement. She says, I, as Minister of Intelligence, on the 7th of, well, on the 12th, I think it was a few days after, I sent that report, and she described it as a humanitarian migration project. Yeah. And in fact, it wasn't that at all. I have the report. It was option C, and it was the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland. It's all there. And that document was prepared well before the 7th of October 2023. Now, there were other elements of the plan as to how they were going to implement the genocide, which obviously were classified. But I can say, having looked at all those documents, they had a plan to destroy Palestine, which had been formulated months, or in fact even years prior to that. At the same time, they had a false flag. They had a false flag, and we have documented that as well. That it's very clear that what is at stake is that they were there. They were intent that that Israelis be killed, to give them the false flag argument. They have applied what was previously called justified revenge, okay? Justified revenge. And they've been doing this for years. They're blaming the Palestinians of killing Israelis when in fact those Israelis were killed as a result of other actions. Netanyahu made the statement to the Likud party. He said, we have to fund Hamas. So, and it's very expressive in the way he says it. People who are against funding Hamas, because Hamas is an instrument which is there to destabilize the Palestinian Authority. They created Hamas. And there's a whole literature on that. There was a statement made by Trump to the effect that Gaza would go under the jurisdiction of the United States as a territory. Now, they're not going to take control over Gaza to rebuild some fancy Riviera-style, project. Their interest is the billions and billions of dollars of natural gas, which belongs to, well, it still belongs to Palestine in many regards. But I think what's going to happen, they're going to put it under US jurisdiction, under US laws, and there's money behind that. And there are interests already in natural gas extending. Again, we're talking about something which extends over the whole Eastern Mediterranean. Now, there's another element, is that I think there are indications that the United States is intent upon establishing a sort of, they won't say it's a colony, but they have established one of their largest embassies worldwide in Iraq, and that's meant for administration. It's the largest U.S. embassy worldwide. Now, why would they have to have the largest embassy worldwide? Well, it is the colonial government, and they're doing the same thing in Lebanon. The Greater Israel Project geographically coincides with the new Middle East, so to speak. Okay. And there you have already a military presence. You have a military presence. You have a diplomatic presence. You have territories which are going to be under U.S. jurisdiction and U.S. laws. If we're talking about Gaza, that's really what is implied. A third world war may, under various assumptions, turn out to be a nuclear war. Now, as I mentioned, a nuclear war, irrespective of the capacity of the nuclear weapons which are being used, will lead to the unthinkable. It threatens humanity entirely. I spent several days with Fidel Castro. He had already left politics, but he was reading everything. He was up to date with everything that was happening. And he concluded his discussion with me. He said, in the case of a nuclear war, the collateral damage would be humanity in its entirety. And I think that that statement is correct. And that statement is corroborated by so many scientific reports. The problem is our decision makers, political decision makers, do not have the foggiest idea as to the consequences of them pressing the button or saying, well, this is not really, this is a preemptive nuclear weapon, you know, safe for civilians. And that's why we've transferred it to the conventional war theater. Well, I don't think that the three-star general would take that decision without going through the command structures, strategic command, etc. But I would trust much more the military than the politicians, and particularly Trump. Now, I mean, he sets tariffs here and there without even reflecting on what the consequences are. Mm-hmm. And then he said, well, okay, let's try the nuclear bomb. Okay, and he said, well, it's tactical. Oh, and such has already said they're harmless for civilians, etc. Now, the tactical nuclear weapons are something of the order between 1/3 and 12 times a Hiroshima bomb. So I think if we have to emphasize our commitment to world peace and our commitment to humanity, an understanding of nuclear war is absolutely essential. Mm-hmm. And it should be something which should be given priority. But the fact that Obama actually justified this $1 trillion nuclear weapons program based on Al-Qaeda, this is a lie, but it's a very dangerous lie. Yeah. And I think he's the most dangerous president that we've ever had. If the U.S. government has problems of debt and expenditures and fiscal crisis, etc., they should reduce the production of military equipment. They don't need, and besides, most of that military equipment is obsolete. They're producing weapons, they're producing nuclear bombs, and without reflecting on the fact that this creates a crisis within the civilian economy. Now, are there solutions to that? Yes, there are. If Trump were really committed to world peace without sort of creating problems within the structure of military expenditures, he should initiate a program which would enable the military-industrial complex to enter into civilian production on a massive scale. That's not something which is impossible. And it could be put forth as a proposal, and it would create employment. It would be a peacemaking military-industrial complex without the military. Civilian complex, civilian industrial complex. All these companies have the ability to produce for the civilian economy. Now that would be a project, but he doesn't do that. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars which are wasted, and in many cases is to produce weapons which are dysfunctional. Okay, and it shouldn't surprise us that in some areas the Chinese are well ahead of us in terms of aerospace technologies, etc. And the Russians, of course, are. But the problem is that the industry, the military industrial complex in Russia is controlled by the government. It's a public sector initiative, whereas here we have a bunch of private companies. Well, the cost of war is within the structure of civilian and military and other expenditures. And if you have a country which is committed to producing weapons, this inevitably has an impact on other areas which are priority. Now, in the United States, people can't pay their rent. We have it in Canada as well. People are poor, they don't have jobs, purchasing power has collapsed, there's inflation. Now, if you want to resolve all those problems, you would have to demilitarize your expenditures. You would have to say, right, well, spend less on that. And then we'll come to an agreement with the Russians that they do the same. Now, the Russians would want to do that because they've been strung with military expenditures from the beginning of the 20th century. I think what is wasteful to a society as a whole is if that society is committed to waging war on other countries. And the way they should tackle that is to come to agreements to ensure world peace through diplomatic means, through consultations. You have several wars which were implemented by the United States in what we call the post-war era. Well, of course, Vietnam, Cambodia, but we also had other wars which were of a regime change nature. When one can look at cost in terms of money, and one can look at cost in terms of life. In other words, civil society, societal projects. But you cannot develop the civilian economy, your social programs, your infrastructure, your roads and travel and links with other countries when a large percentage of your national budget is entrusted to weapons of mass destruction. If we were informed by the media in an honest way with documentation, without any intrusion from politicians and without any intrusion from corporate companies, if we had been informed of what the consequences of war would be, we would say, no, we don't want that. And if it had been a full-fledged democracy, we would say, ask our representatives, say, no, absolutely abolish all military expenditures. They could do it if they reach an agreement with Russia. They could do it. Now, why is Trump not addressing that issue? He wants America to be great again, but there's no money for civilian expenditures. And that means you can't make America great again with all the money going into producing nuclear bombs. But that I'm it's exaggerating a little bit but that really is what's happening. Okay. Now it's the guns and butter. Now we don't have any butter. We've got guns. And that's so important, and within a democracy where you have members, you have senators and members of the House of Representatives who can say, well, what's happening? What about my people there in whom I represent? And all we do was spending money on weapons. And then he'll say, well, we have to protect ourselves against the Russians, okay? The Russians are coming. Well, I remember the film But the Russians have never threatened the United States of America, nor have they threatened Western Europe. I mean, you look at their history. And when you ask, I'm not doing an apology for the Russians, okay? But if you ask them, do you have any wars that you'd like to undertake? And they'll say, well, listen, our country is far too big. And we don't need to expand our territory any more than what it is today. That's the standard answer. So we're not interested in war. Now, if you look at Chinese history, the old Silk Road, China has never invaded other countries. It's what they call the Middle Kingdom. Chongguo, it's the Middle Kingdom, and they establish commercial and banking arrangements in countries all over the world, but they never go in with troops. Well, listen, the power center of the world is the world, and first of all, it's around. You know, it's round. It's not flat. Now, some people think it's flat. I don't know whether Trump believes it's flat or not, but that's part of the propaganda. But I mean, propaganda is hideous. Propaganda is hideous. And I can say, well, I've been an author and I've written for mainstream media, and if you say the truth, they cut you off. And I've experienced that when I was in France. I was working for Le Monde Diplomatique, which is a very prestigious monthly. And then when we started covering the war, the U.S. NATO war against Yugoslavia, which the pretext was fabricated. They came to the support of the Kosovo Liberation Army, which was linked up to organized crime, and in Italy, and which was also linked up to Al Qaeda, and the head of that organization had a file in Interpol. Now, they said, no, you can't write that. You can't mention that. You can't mention that the prime minister, he became prime minister and then he became president of Kosovo, and 23 years later, they sent him to The Hague for the crimes he had committed in the 1990s on the instructions of US NATO. I mean, that's what happened. Well, you know, I believe in humanity. I believe in truth. Everything that we publish has to be based on some honesty. We'd have disagreements within, but that's part of real life. Some people are libertarians, others are socialists, others are whatever, neoliberals. I would even have a debate with neoliberals, but I know what the results of their policies will be. I know from an economic standpoint how people are impoverished. So that for me, I started analyzing poverty and national economies, how they're destroyed, literally, and that was an economic warfare. When you say the price of energy goes up by so much, the thing is that the press is censored, the search engines are censored. If they don't like something, they'll take it down. Okay. And I think we have to say, is peace at the global level an objective? Bearing in mind that we are in an era where the technologies of mass destruction are beyond description, and any kind of mistake, whether it's artificial intelligence or misunderstanding of of what the consequences will be, and also the ignorance of politicians. But at the same time, the complexities can't be fully understood.